that makes it very difficult to sneak up on some of these bucks. And they know when things are happening, so a lot of them are in this hiding spot by 5 o'clock in the morning. The trick, I think, is the rifle season. So archery season, we have a lot more participation in the archery season than we did, even 10 years ago. But there's not enough that it disturbs deer behavior that I could detect from watching the movements of these deer. There's nothing, you couldn't, if I didn't tell you what time of the year it was, you wouldn't know whether it's July or September or October. Of course, late October and November, when the rut cuts in, you'd know what time of year it is. But so it's the rifle season that terrain influences deer movements. And I don't want to put it out there that deer are smart. It's some deer get lucky, right? So they get disturbed and they run to a spot, and that spot happens to be a place where there's less likely to be a hunter. And so deer learn that, okay, when there's this disturbance, I'm going to run there and set up. And, I've looked at lots of movements of our deer, and if you go on the Deer Forest blog, you can see lots of movies that I've made that show this. There's certain key features that serve as a good hiding spot, right? So it's a steep slope, and especially a pattern that pops up with bucks is that it's not really a ridge top, but a high spot with a near steep terrain. So it could be a plateau, but they're right on the edge where that plateau drops off. Or it could be in our ridge and valley, it could be on top of the ridge, but there's a very steep slope. And oftentimes the steep slope is to the east, and it may not be quite as steep to the west. And I think the advantage there is that there's wind is coming from westerly direction, so they can sense things on the non-steep slope through scent, and the steep slope is sort of an escape hatch, or if there's something coming up there, there's no way that it can't hear you coming. But they can literally jump off that little lip of wherever that high spot, go down that steep slope, and they'll be 300 yards away from you in 15 seconds. So that makes it very difficult to sneak up on some of these bucks. And they know when things are happening. So a lot of them are in this hiding spot by 5 o'clock in the morning. And it's not legal shooting hours till about 7 during our rifle season. So they're there in their hiding spot, bedded down, and they'll stay there till 10, 12 o'clock, noon. And then you'll see those movements pick up in the afternoon. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was the one doe I call Hillside Doe because 5 a.m. she'd be in her hiding spot, really steep spot high up on the edge of the ridge, usually moving 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right, it's shooting hours are done around 5. She's already walking down in the bottom around the camps and stuff. And then the next morning, she does the same thing. 5 o'clock in the morning, she's back up in her hiding spot, sits there all morning, and then might start moving in the afternoon. And just repeat that for 12 days till the hunting season's over.
And see, to me, this is so fascinating because of the conditioning standpoint. If they survive that initial, season, that gun season, and survive getting bumped and finding an area that they are comfortable in and they're not getting bumped out, or they're not smelling in any kind of humans, they're not seeing anybody. It's almost like just classic conditioning. That's that spot they can go to and be safe. And you're seeing this with bucks and does in these areas during the very high pressure gun seasons. and commonality between steep terrain with, again, the predominant wind direction, so they can smell anything on the less steep side, but also have a quick access path off the steep side if they need to.
You know, I can talk about Buck 8917 because I walked up to his hiding spot, and you know, my wife and dogs, we decided to take a hike on a Sunday, and the only thing I can say is that you don't want to walk into that place in the dark because it's steep. It's, you know, we have talus slopes where it's very rocky, just almost bare rock. So it's really tough. I wouldn't want to walk in the dark. I think what you'd have to do is you could start at daylight or maybe a little bit before dark and at the shallow part, but once it gets steep, you could hike up there, but I guarantee you're not going to get there for an hour at best after hunting hours start, at best. You could hunt there during the day and maybe sit up on that ridge and maybe catch a deer that's moving along the ridge in the afternoon, but you're going to have to head out around 3:30 in the afternoon because there's no way you want to walk down trying to carry your rifle or dragging your deer out. It is really steep. So, and you know, I wrote a blog post about, you know, if I were going to hunt Buck 8917, this is how I'd do it. And there are other guys that made similar comments. They said, yeah, that was when I was younger, that was my strategy, and I was very successful. But again, you have to give up those optimal hours, right? The first hour after dawn, after sunrise and legal shooting hours, and the last hour before shooting hours end. You basically have to give that up because that's the time that you're walking in and out of there.
Interesting. So, and that's another thing that's fascinating about this, because with us being in the deep south, there's some mountain systems that we've hunted, like the lower Appalachian Mountains. Appalachian. How do we say it again?
Appalachian.
People from North Carolina, Tennessee get real upset if you don't say it correctly. But really rugged, steep areas, and there's a lot of similarities across a lot of the southeast. Because again, we live 15 hours almost from here. But there's a lot of similarities to like what you were finding in studies and what some of our other hunters in the deep south that hunt mountains see specifically. Those rugged areas hold those big bucks, specifically during high pressure hunts, and especially where we're at, it's gun seasons, because we have most of the southeast states have very long gun seasons. Now, one other caveat, because I want to keep staying on like the core areas, the safe areas that they're spending during the gun season. But what is the deer population like in these areas? From a deer density standpoint, because I think that might play a factor as well. So it varies quite a bit. These estimates are after the hunting season. So, you know, one of our study areas probably has about 10 deer per square mile. The two areas up north are 20 deer per square mile, 18 to 20. And the other one in the south, just south of State College here, is probably around 18 to 20 deer per square mile. Okay.
So that's after the hunting season, right? And so we've harvested, 25% of the adult bucks, 40, maybe 50% of the, maybe 40 to 50% maybe of the adult bucks, probably on the lower side, because we're finding in these large tracts of public land that harvest rates on these deer is actually lower. And then, of course, fairly low harvest rates on 1.5-year-old bucks because of our antler point restrictions. And then harvest rates on does are in the 20% range. So, so we're surveying our deer density estimates at the lowest point of the population, after the hunting season and before recruitment occurs in the spring.
So definitely not a super low deer population, per square mile, but That's really interesting. Have y'all ever seen with some of the GPS deer in certain areas of some of the study areas ever crossing paths using some of the same safe areas during that gun season or similar safe areas within distance?
Yeah, we just haven't had enough bucks collared all in the same area to know. But like I said, that 8917, we just happened to have 2 bucks in the same area, and they had large overlapping home ranges. So I'm sure they do. We just don't have enough of the population collared to answer that question.
Also, talk about the terrain standpoint of where these deer are spending a lot of their time during that high pressure gun hunt and gun season. Have you been able to get in there and look at vegetation cover and seeing what that looks like in some of the spots along with the terrain?
We are on the cusp of doing that. So let me back up a little bit. Probably about 15 years ago, I had a student looking at harvest rates of deer in the up on the Allegheny Plateau. So on both public and private land. And so, of course, road access on private land is always much better than it is on public land because a lot of roads are gated and limited. And so he was looking at harvest rates, and he was also looking at hunter density. And so what he found is that on the public land, most hunters were within a quarter mile of a road that was open to public travel. And what he found was that there was this sweet spot for harvesting a deer. So it wasn't right next to the road, and it wasn't really far away. It was about a half mile from a road was the place where a deer was most likely to be harvested. If it had a home range about a half mile from the road, that's where it was most likely to be harvested. And I think that can be explained, but this was back before GPS collars, right? So we had VHF, and basically all we could say is, well, their home range is kind of here. But beyond that, we didn't know any detailed movements. But he could show that deer that lived close to roads and far from roads had lower harvest rates than deer that were in the middle. And I think part of that is there was so much, since most hunters were concentrated near roads, deer who had home ranges in that area moved out. And deer that are far away from a road, they're not disturbed. And then they're more likely to encounter deer that are, in that half-mile range. And so where hunter density was sort of the sweet spot for hunter density, it weren't too many hunters, but there are enough hunters to move deer around and increase hunter success rates. So that was sort of the first hint that there's some factors. And he showed that topography influenced distance to road and topography. So really steep slopes, there aren't any hunters, right? I can't blame them. I mean, these are really steep slopes in places, and far from a road, and it's conflated, right? So usually places far from the road are also steep. But there was that question that was answered. To answer your other question about how vegetation influences, well, what we have to have is a map of the total study area, right? To say, okay, this area has dense understory, and this study area doesn't, or this part of the study area does not, and we're more likely to find a deer here than over here. And up until now, we've never had that map of understory density. But there is, probably many of your listeners have heard of LIDAR technology. So we now have LIDAR technology, which is basically like a radar, or it's a laser, I think, that it just shoots down, and as a plane flies over, it will tell you the elevation at when that signal was bounced back, right? So you can pretty much tell where the ground is because that's the lowest spot, and you can tell the top of the canopy. But if you have a thick understory or no understory, you can also get a sense of that too, because there'll be a lot more variation and scatter in those mid-understory stuff. And so we actually have a grad student who is looking in our southern study areas where we have all this mountain laurel, and between LIDAR and aerial satellite imagery, in the wintertime when you fly over our ridge and valley region, there's lots of green, and that's not because there's grass growing, it's because it's mountain laurel, which is like rhododendron. It keeps its leaves on all winter. So between the LIDAR and the aerial imagery, she can actually build us a map of understory density. And so another one of my students is going to be taking the deer data and looking to see, I think that you're going to predict if there's more mountain laurel in their home range, they're probably less likely to get harvested during the hunting season. And he'll be able to look at how topography, distance from road, understory density all influences whether the likelihood a deer gets harvested. And so all I can say is stay tuned. I don't have an answer today.
I love that, though. That's exciting. And